I'm the director of the Nuclear Strategy and Non-Proliferation Initiative here at the New America Foundation, which makes this a sort of interesting talk for me to moderate because in my business we're mostly responsible for how we got into Iraq. And this is a talk about what's going to happen going forward. And so it's the other end of the business for me. But I'm incredibly excited to have Stephanie Kaplan and Peter Bergen here to discuss what effect Iraq is going to have on global terrorist movements and al-Qaeda. And I think one of the things that is most impressive about the New America Foundation as an institution is the degree to which we have an eclectic group of thinkers who are involved in our work, who really come at things with very different perspectives. You know, there isn't an ideological litmus test, and I think you can see that in some of the handouts we have out by the front table. There's Nir Rosen's article, The Flight from Iraq, about the Iraqi refugee crisis. There's Peter Bergen's article, The Iraq Effect, and then we have an article by, or a monograph really, by Richard Vague, who's a conservative CEO. And these papers all approach the issue of the effect that Iraq is having on terrorists and global jihadist movements from very different perspectives. And I think that that's something that I find extremely valuable. We recently had a senior staff retreat, and I think Peter got off the line of the entire retreat when he read a quote from Secretary Rumsfeld and asked essentially, you know, do we know that we are either killing or detaining more terrorists than we are creating? And then Peter said that he had the novel idea to simply actually attempt to count attacks, which he delivered with the sort of accent that made that seem much more wittier than when I do it. And I think that what we're going to hear today is an elaboration of that concept from Stephanie Kaplan, who takes a really rather different methodological approach. And so, I mean, I think what we actually have is a possibility for a real and interesting debate about how to answer these questions rather than some of the same hackneyed discussions about whether or not invading Iraq was a good thing in the first place. Stephanie is extremely well qualified to discuss this issue. Stephanie and I have known each other for quite a long time. When she began working at CSIS as a research associate. After that, she picked up time as an associate at the Aspen Strategy Group and then played a central role in the 9/11 Commission. She was managing editor of the report, so you will find few people who know as much about al-Qaeda and the horrible attacks of September 11th than Stephanie. And after achieving what I think is, after really getting to the point where she had done about the most interesting thing that one can do in Washington in playing such a central role in one of those commissions, Stephanie decided to take a break for a while and get a PhD at MIT, where we were neighbors for a year when I was up the road. And so Stephanie is going to present the results, or rather the results of her initial inquiry into this question, which I suspect will form the foundation of an extremely successful dissertation and a very important book. Stephanie?
Good afternoon. I want to thank Steve Clemens, who couldn't be here today, and Jeffrey Lewis for inviting me to speak here today. One of the distinct pleasures of building a career in Washington is seeing the people who you met early on go on to contribute to important policy debates in meaningful ways. And through the Nuclear Strategy and Non-Proliferation Initiative here at New America and his blog, my friend Jeffrey Lewis is doing just that now. Jeffrey doesn't know this, but I actually applied to the New America Foundation for a job straight out of college, and I didn't end up getting an interview. And as he mentioned, I ended up at another think tank down the road, and the first person that I met on the first day of my first job was Jeffrey Lewis. So I want to thank New America for having the foresight to overlook my application. If they hadn't rejected me, I probably wouldn't be here today. I also want to express my gratitude to Peter Bergen for joining us. This talk is really meant to be a continuation of a dialogue that he started, first with his 2005 piece in Foreign Affairs, and more recently with the article that he co-authored in Mother Jones, which is outside for your for your distribution. So I'm particularly honored that we'll be able to benefit from his insight today. Now, my presentation, as many of you know, is entitled Breeding in Afghanistan, Feeding in Iraq. And you probably saw the title, specifically the words breeding and feeding, and thought that this talk would be about sex and food. And unfortunately for you, the next 25 minutes is just not going to be that interesting. So instead, the subject of this talk is about the Jihad Effect, my shorthand for war's impact on the trajectory of terrorist movements, and an homage to Peter's Mother Jones article, The Iraq Effect. Today, scholars and policymakers are interested in the impact of a particular war, Iraq, on a particular terrorist movement, al-Qaeda, and rightfully so. Whether or not you believe the Iraq War was the appropriate response to 9/11, it is now the central front in the war on terror. But I think in order to determine the Iraq effect and to do so in a way that is useful to policymakers, we need to take a step back and examine the relationship between wars and terrorist movements in general. We need to understand the Jihad effect. And so today I'm going to present you with a framework for analyzing this Jihad effect with the hope that it will provide a foundation for a more nuanced discussion about al-Qaeda's post-Iraq trajectory. So to introduce the framework, I'm going to begin with a brief excerpt from a recent piece in Time magazine called The Enemy's New Tools in Iraq. And it starts off like this. Saif Abdullah says his inventions have helped kill or maim scores, possibly hundreds of Americans. For more than 4 years, he has been developing remote control devices that Sunni insurgents use to detonate IEDs. The only time he ever felt a pang of regret was in the spring of 2006, when he heard that the Pentagon, in a bid to fight the growing IED menace, had roped in a team of scientists from MIT. Abdullah, an electronics engineer by training, once dreamed of studying for a PhD there. I thought to myself, if my life had gone differently, who knows, I might have been on that team, he says. Then he shrugs. God decided I should be on the other side. Now, the article goes on to describe Abdullah, a geeky 28-year-old sitting in his apartment fashioning detonators out of household items. And I read this article as I sat in my apartment near MIT, where I'm working to earn a PhD. And as I read this passage, I wondered, what will happen to Abdullah after the Iraq War ends? What will happen to the people that are, in Abdullah's words, always asking him for new ways to go boom? Today I want to ask you to think about Abdullah as a resource mobilized by the Iraq War. The technical knowledge that he propagates to others is a resource as well. In fact, as the premier defensive jihad, the Iraq War generates a variety of tangible and intangible assets, both on and off the battlefield. And so if you want to understand Iraq's impact on al-Qaeda, then you have to follow the resources that the war produces. Resources, I believe, are at the heart of the relationship between armed conflicts and terrorism, and their distribution shapes the nature of these movements long after the last battle draws to a close. This is the central argument that I wish to make today. Now, what do I mean by distribution of resources? This is really just a fancy way of asking, who controls the resources that the war produces? I see two mechanisms, breeding and feeding, that providing a window into the allocation of wartime assets. Now, breeding takes place when armed resistance groups consolidate and repurpose wartime resources in support of an innovative strategy, thereby fostering the rise of a new terrorist movement. We see this occurring on the battlefields of Afghanistan during the 1980s with the creation of al-Qaeda. Feeding, on the other hand, occurs when wartime resources are dispersed throughout the existing jihadist movement. But because movements, unlike states, are often ill-equipped to manage their assets, the endowment diffuses spontaneously throughout the network. Right now, al-Qaeda's high commanders do not appear to be very good at managing their newfound endowment. And without the ability to deploy these resources in a concerted manner, we see them applied to various goals through various means and by various actors, all under this umbrella of the global jihadist movement. This diffuse distribution of resources mobilized by the Iraq War is thus the defining characteristic of the global jihadist movement today. The Iraq War is feeding al-Qaeda, and the result is a more self-sustaining and organic movement that coexists alongside the high command. Now, I realize there are several moving parts to this argument, and I'm going to ask you to bear with me as I walk you through each of them step by step and then consider the policy implications. But first I want to acknowledge the fact that I'm far from the first person to identify the issue of jihadist blowback from Iraq War. At the risk of sounding like a public service announcement, the terrorism problem needs more scholarship and less punditry. And that demands that we as analysts acknowledge the advances that others have made, while at the same time looking for ways to contribute to the existing dialogue. So in that spirit, I want to take a few minutes to address the way that others have tried to sort out Iraq's terrorism legacy, and I think two approaches merit our attention. The first group employs what I call the Afghanistan analogy, revisiting the Soviet-Afghan War for clues about al-Qaeda's post-Iraq trajectory. The second method tracks the incidence of global terrorist attacks, and its proponents assert that the ongoing conflict has led to an uptick in jihadist terrorism around the world. First to the analogy. When leaks revealed some of the content of the April 2006 NIE on global terrorism last fall, they caused a political sensation. But I think it's safe to say that in the counterterrorism community, we greeted its findings with little fanfare. Among the NIE's key judgments were that the Iraq Jihad had become one of the main drivers of the global jihadist movement. At the time, Daniel Benjamin and Stephen Simon observed, quote, "The declassified judgments from the NIE on terrorism caused a stir in the political world this week, but for most, we would guess all scholars of jihadist terrorism, they are largely uncontroversial." One unnamed intelligence official agreed, noting that the NIE was merely stating the obvious. It is worth pondering why this finding seems so obvious to those who study al-Qaeda. To be sure, the NIE's reception can't be attributed to any wealth of research on the Jihad Effect. But in place of scholarship, however, we do find commentators making frequent comparisons between Iraq and the Soviet-Afghan War. And this comparison, the Afghanistan analogy, reads like a question from a high school SAT exam. The Soviet-Afghan War was to al-Qaeda in the 1980s as the Iraq War is to al-Qaeda today. The former conflict gave rise to al-Qaeda, an outcome recognized by many to be one of the most egregious examples of blowback in U.S. foreign policy history. Today, the Iraq War provides Islamist extremists with another formative opportunity to fight against a superpower. And so, the argument goes, we should expect the current conflict to likewise exacerbate the global jihadist movement. Put simply, according to the logic of the Afghanistan analogy, wars make terrorism worse. I think that this analogy is so firmly rooted in the pantheon of conventional wisdom, even across political spectrums to some extent, that I could only find one expert, the gentleman sitting to my right, questioning its appropriateness. But analyzing the current conflict through the prism of the Soviet-Afghan War has led to, at best, oversimplified and at worst, incorrect conclusions about Iraq's terrorism legacy. So I think it's time for it to be retired for three reasons, and I'll run through them briefly. First, it masks crucial differences between the two wars, differences that may be more illuminating than its similarities. For example, there's just no comparing the quantity and quality of jihadist battlefield experience between the two wars. And in contrast to the myths propagated about the role of the Arab Afghans during the Soviet-Afghan War, this time those myths have actually become a reality. And the tactics that the jihadists are learning in Iraq are much more relevant to terrorist operations outside the theater. If wars are truly conveyor belts for terrorists, then we should want to know the make and model of the terrorists in production. But rather than focusing our attention on these potentially relevant differences, the Afghanistan analogy glosses over them. Second, the Afghanistan analogy leaves no room for the possibility that the outcomes of two jihadist wars can be different, though both negative. We know that the outcome of the Soviet-Afghan War was a new movement, and yet analysts constantly use this episode to explain how today's conflict will shape an existing movement. I believe that these are two fundamentally different types of blowback, and any approach to this problem needs to take this possibility into account. This distinction is important from both an empirical and policy perspective, and it leads me to my third critique, namely that the Afghanistan analogy does not offer a conceptual foundation for sound policy analysis. For those seeking to respond to and anticipate trends in terrorism, worse is an indeterminate and insufficient basis for crafting strategy. Terrorism trends can take a turn for the worse in a variety of different ways, and analysts need to provide policymakers with more fine-grained assessments of our enemies' trajectories. I'm going to steal my water for 1 second. Thank you. So at best, the Afghanistan analogy teaches us that the Iraq War will produce blowback without specifying what that blowback might be. Now, one way that blowback can occur is when a terrorist movement commits more attacks or commits more lethal attacks. So, setting the Afghanistan analogy aside, a second method for determining Iraq's terrorism legacy is simply to measure the incidence and lethality of jihadist terrorist attacks pre- and post-invasion. Peter Bergen and his co-author recently authored an article called The Jihad Effect, and this was the first and only study to do just that. Their study is an important contribution because first, it puts the issue of the relationship between war and terrorism front and center. And secondly, it really allows us to contrast the in-theater trends, what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, with the relative calm that we see happening throughout the globe, something that has since been corroborated by the State Department's country reports on terrorism. Now, I say relative calm because they found a tremendous difference between the incidents of jihadist terrorist attacks committed on and off the battlefield. This makes sense since terrorist attacks committed on the battlefield as part of a sustained wartime campaign should be qualitatively and quantitatively different than those that we're used to studying. All of you should read the Iraq Effect, but for those of you unfamiliar with its findings, they found that post-invasion attacks increased sevenfold, including Iraq and Afghanistan, but when the data was limited to anti-Western targets, there was a much more modest 25% increase in attacks, going from 7.2 per year to 9 per year. So I must admit that the statistical case for the Iraq Effect was actually not as strong as I expected it to be, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this point specifically. And since terrorist attacks are a rare event, the sample size for anti-Western trends, again rising from just 7.2 to 9, is really just too small for us to draw any firm conclusions right now. So that's not your fault. The numbers are what they are, and you've done a huge service to us by shedding light on these trends. But the question is then, what conclusions are appropriate for us to draw from this type of data? Given the small increase in anti-Western attacks, we could simply conclude that the Iraq Effect doesn't exist, but more likely, as you acknowledge in the article, there could be a lag effect. But then tracking the incidence of terrorist attacks really doesn't help us understand the problem before it translates into additional events that we want to try to prevent. And finally, and most importantly, the Iraq Effect could simply manifest itself in ways that are not captured by incident or lethality data. You underscore this point in the article by noting that the geographic distribution of attacks seems to be shifting, with more attacks in Europe, North Africa, and in the immediate Middle East, excluding Iraq. And to get at this point from a different angle, think about conducting the same study but for the Soviet-Afghan War. What would have been the Afghanistan effect? It was a crucially important episode, and yet in terms of attack data, we can't really measure its effect in a meaningful way. By focusing on the number of terrorist events, we would miss an altogether entirely different event, which was the birth of al-Qaeda. So in sum, the Iraq Effect study is an important contribution, clearing some of the empirical brush that needed to be cleared. But like at the Afghanistan analogy, I think the study confirmed my belief that in order to understand Iraq's terrorism legacy at an empirical level, you have to start unpacking the relationship between armed conflicts and terrorism at a conceptual level. So to that end, I'm now going to present you with for your consideration, my approach for understanding the Jihad Effect. And I think the framework is best explained by asking and answering 3 questions. First, do wars produce resources, and if so, why? Second, how do wars produce resources? And third, where do these resources go after the war ends? I'm going to run briefly through the first 2 questions so that I can spend the remainder of my time on the third question, which focuses our attention on the breeding and feeding of terrorist movements during wartime. Then I'll close by discussing some of the broader policy implications of the Jihad Effect. Question number 1. Do wars produce resources, and if so, why? Wars are among the most destructive forces on the planet. Not only do armed conflicts deplete the resources of warring parties, but they leave a trail of devastation in their wake. I seek to turn this conventional wisdom on its head by arguing that some wars, on balance, are actually productive experiences. A specific subset of wars, defensive jihads, which entail armed resistance against a foreign or domestic threat to the land of Islam, are especially likely to mobilize a vast amount of resources. Understanding the nature of the defensive jihad is the first step to unlocking the broader relationship between armed conflicts and terrorism. And I contend that they tend to be productive for 3 reasons. First, they appeal to the individual obligation of Muslims. Second, they draw upon a transnational Islamic identity. And third, they confirm the popular narrative that Islam is under attack. I'm going to skip through the reasons why I think all of those are relevant, but I'd be happy to answer questions on each of them. So going ahead to question number 2, how do wars produce resources? If you accept the premise that defensive jihads are uniquely positioned to mobilize assets, then the next step is to consider the manner in which they mobilize these assets as well. Put simply, these conflicts create tangible and intangible resources both on and off the battlefield, and this occurs in 2 ways. The first is by just providing a warfighting experience, which produces valuable assets for the movement over time. The second occurs when various actors off the battlefield, individuals, groups, or states, commit themselves and or their own assets to the cause. Now, on the battlefield, the story is fairly straightforward. The experience of war, not to be confused with the outcome of war, gives jihadis an opportunity to gain skills, tactical, operational, management, and establish intense social bonds. As discussed previously, depending on the nature and quality of the combat experience, fighters will gain skills that they can translate into much-needed expertise over time. And perhaps of greatest consequence is the networking opportunity that war affords some of the most violent people on the planet. The social experience of defensive jihad creates opportunities for friendship, kinship, and discipleship, which can translate ultimately into a lifetime of extremism. And the terrorists know this. One prominent jihadist strategist, Abu Bakr al-Naji, captured this dynamic precisely in his management of savagery when he writes, "We will achieve ideal results through using the type of education that is not complete save through battle. Through the atmosphere of battle, they will become ready, nay, they will surpass their teachers." Now, off the battlefield, wars create resources at the individual group and state level, as I mentioned before. At the individual level, people can support the movement by providing manpower, by just picking up and leaving their local setting and fighting in the jihad. If such a trip isn't feasible, they may simply support the jihad financially or just turn a blind eye to nefarious activities in their community. If that doesn't satisfy their call to action, they may decide to fight in a more convenient proxy war. Still others may take it upon themselves to commit attacks against a local target, and such activity falls into a category of a self-starting cell. At the group level, militant Islamist organizations can ally with al-Qaeda on a formal or informal basis. These groups can funnel people, money, and material to the battlefield, or reluctant to siphon off its own resources, they may channel their energies into local contention and claim that such actions are undertaken in the movement's behalf. This enables the broader movement to receive credit for activity that it did not direct. Finally, support at the state level comes in various forms. In his study of state sponsors of terror, Dan Byman identifies 6 types of support: training and operations, money, arms and logistics, help with organizing, diplomatic backing, ideological direction, and sanctuary, all of which could occur in response to a defensive jihad. So a key point about these assets created outside the war zone is that while a portion of them may be directed toward the conflict itself, some of them may never make it to the battlefield. This begs the question, once created, how are these resources allocated? Who decides how they're employed? If the relationship between war and terrorism centers on the notion that some wars can and produce assets, then the next logical step to ask is, where do they go? I have 2 answers for this question: breeding and feeding. The first prong of the jihad effect is the breeding mechanism, the process by which wars create new terrorist movements. Now, of course, not all wars breed terrorist movements, but the pattern appears to be common to more than a few terrorist organizations, and some of the most virulent ones at that. What explains this pattern? Well, I argue that breeding occurs when established resistance groups consolidate the wartime resources and apply them to a new, innovative strategy. And decades of social movement research tell us that established social settings play a catalytic role in origins of movements. And I try not to get too academic here, but this is a really important point. We tend to think of established social settings like mosques and schools and soccer teams, but groups that fight in wars are established social settings as well. And subnational Islamist groups mobilize to fight in jihadist wars, both of the interstate and civil variety, and eventually those wars end. Assuming they don't become a part of the state apparatus or go underground, another option remains. They could form a successor movement with a new mission, a terrorist mission. So it becomes no surprise that extremely violent movements can emerge from established groups already organized for violent purposes. But for wars to breed movements, their presence is necessary but insufficient. Movements emerge when existing groups take the following 3 steps. First, they declare new ends or goals. Second, they declare new means or tactics. And third, they consolidate the existing wartime resources. So in other words, movements emerge when there's strategic innovation and resource concentration at a war's end. Now this process, as I've outlined it, holds quite well in the Soviet-Afghan case. Al-Qaeda's inception is a familiar story to most of you, and so I'm not going to go through all the details. But I'll just say that the breeding mechanism does provide a unique perspective into this well-traversed historical terrain and makes the birth of al-Qaeda seem a little bit less ad hoc than most of us make it out to be. We see an existing social group, the Bureau of Services, or MAK, transform into a terrorist movement, al-Qaeda, by taking the necessary steps for movement emergence. 1, it adopts new ends by targeting the far enemy. 2, it employs new means by taking up terrorism. And 3, it consolidates the resources generated by the defensive jihad, of which they were considerable. Now, I don't think this is what we're seeing in Iraq today. The second prong of the jihad effect is the feeding mechanism, the process by which wars shape the size and nature of an existing movement's resource base. And as we saw with breeding, resources play an important role in movement emergence. It is difficult for new movements to get off the ground without the capability to pursue its new strategy. But the endowment story doesn't stop there. After a terrorist movement emerges and becomes established, what happens when it encounters another defensive jihad? How do existing movements exploit the resources of subsequent armed conflicts? I argue that, unlike states, established movements are generally unable to control the allocation of wartime resources. As a result, resources are distributed in a diffuse manner throughout the network, and this distribution pattern has major strategic consequences. Movements in states differ in many ways, and we're used to thinking about the world in terms of states, but it's important to emphasize the ways in which they differ in order to understand our enemy. One of the most striking differences is their respective ability to monopolize resources for their own ends. States are hierarchies that exist to collect and redistribute goods, and they're very good at doing this during wartime, but movements are not. And although certain nodes within the network may enjoy more prominence than others, there exists no ordering principle to determine which individuals and which groups and which associations should have the authority to decide the fate of these newfound assets. So as the war continues to mobilize assets, the constellation of the resources becomes more and more disaggregated. And the strategic implications of this distribution pattern are crucial. Defensive jihads cause the resource base to expand, to be sure, but the key nodes within a network cannot reliably direct the bulk of those resources to support a unified strategy. Thus, the newly deployed and the newly endowed deploy their assets as they wish in support of various ends and various means with no authority to coordinate between and among them. Now, it's always difficult to assess a case in midstream, but already the Iraq War bears several hallmarks of the feeding process. Both on and off the battlefield, the conflict generates and will continue to generate resources in support of the global jihadist movement. Anecdotally, we hear evidence of this occurring all the time. The war is the biggest fundraiser for the movement. The war is drawing in people from all over the world. The war is causing a shift in public opinion that's favorable to the Islamists. Yet at the same time, I would argue, al-Qaeda's high commanders, the founders of the movement, are steadily losing their grip over the movement's trajectory. This loss of control, I argue, stems directly from the fact that bin Laden and company no longer hold al-Qaeda's proverbial purse strings, and they can't manage the assets mobilized by the Iraq Jihad. They try to be sure, and we hear reports of these efforts all the time. But if bin Laden were truly in control of the resources generated by the Iraq War, then the pattern of terrorist attacks during the last 4 years, I don't think would look as it has. So what precisely has this pattern been? First, jihadist terrorist attacks since 2003 have been less sophisticated than bin Laden generally likes across the board. Secondly, they are more likely to occur without direct or even indirect support from the high command. And on balance, they're less likely to target the United States, although this doesn't preclude the possibility of attacks against the homeland. Now, these trends may be heartening to some, but from a counterterrorism standpoint, a movement with a disaggregated resource base, an irregular operational code, and a disjointed network with isolated cells is much more difficult to combat than the vintage al-Qaeda. A capable, more predictable enemy with a known network ties is a more vulnerable intelligence target than what we see today, which is a less skilled but more erratic enemy with isolated cells committing spontaneous attacks and learning more and more every day. And by the way, this doesn't mean that the elements of the vintage al-Qaeda or al-Qaeda 1.0 don't exist. It just means that both elements can coexist, engaged in a struggle of sorts over who will control the resources and thus the direction of the movement. The Algeria case is one of the best examples, I think, of a group affiliating with al-Qaeda to get on the Iraq gravy train, and then using Iraq veterans to commit more sophisticated attacks at home. And even though bin Laden and al-Zawahiri publicly embrace these recent incidents as their own, we should not be under the illusion that they prefer amateur hour attacks against U.S. allies and local governments. Trends like those in Algeria, Morocco, and Europe suggest that the movement, enabled by a diffuse resource base, has taken on a life of its own, and this version is more difficult to contain. So in sum, The Jihad Effect framework, I think, repairs a theoretical gap in our understanding of our relationship between wars and terrorism. If you accept the framework's central premise that defensive jihads generate resources and their subsequent distribution has strategic consequences, then several practical implications become apparent. First, the United States should First and foremost, the United States should avoid becoming ensnared in what the Muslim world defines as defensive jihads. Not all wars can be avoided, to be sure, but when such conflicts are wars of choice, then policymakers must weigh the benefits of war very heavily against the jihadist blowback that is bound to ensue. And since we're far past this stage in the debate, I'm not going to dwell on it, but that's a lesson that needs to be noted. And second, as the debate over the Iraq policy continues, we need to focus less on the outcome of the war and more on its prosecution. To would-be and current terrorists, the experience of warfighting is just as, if not more, important as the conflict's end result. And so the war's actual outcome doesn't undo the feeding process. There are consequences to the very act of going to war and sustaining war. So when policymakers state that we can't allow Iraq to become a safe haven, they're missing the point to some extent. Even if we root out al-Qaeda in Iraq during the course of the next year or the next several years, significant damage will already have taken place. And returning Iraq to the pre-2003 status quo, when the country was not an al-Qaeda safe haven, does not mean that al-Qaeda will return to its pre-invasion incarnation. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's a huge amount to take in. I once got in an argument with Stephanie about terrorism. Once. We are extremely lucky to have Peter Bergen here, who is going to give his comments. When I first came to the New America Foundation, a friend of mine called me to sort of see how it was going and get the scoop on the New America Foundation, and he said to me, so, I mean, Peter Bergen, right? That's what you guys are famous for. So I said, no, there are other people, but he wasn't buying it. So I think we are extremely lucky to have Peter here. Thanks.
Thanks for that introduction, and thank you, Stephanie. I guess several things. Well, I mean, the fact that Stephanie was the managing editor of the 9/11 report means that she's the only person in history who's written a U.S. government document that was a New York Times bestseller. But let me just talk a little bit about the study that we did, the Mother Jones piece that you have. We really wanted to answer the question, Donald Rumsfeld famously complained, what are the metrics for winning or losing the war on terrorism? And we thought one metric to look at was what's really happening since the invasion of Iraq. And we compared the period between September 11th and the beginning of the invasion and the period between the beginning of the March 2003 up to the end of 2006. And as Stephanie pointed out, we found a sevenfold increase in incidents. Now, most of those incidents, of course, happened in Iraq, happened in Afghanistan. Some of them happened around the Arab world. A couple of them obviously happened in Europe. There was a decline in Southeast Asia, which has got nothing to do one way or the other with the Iraq War. So we did find, I think, that there was an effect that could be pointed to, what we call the Iraq effect. Our study probably understates the real effect because we used very conservative methodology. We only looked at attacks that had killed one person or more. We only looked at attacks that could be attributed to a known jihadist group. A lot of attacks in Iraq can't be attributed to known groups, for instance. Commenting a little bit on what Stephanie said, I think that it is useful to look at the Afghan War versus the Iraq War. And let me tell you what happened, in my view, in the Afghan War and the whole question of the foreign fighters there and how it differs from what's going on in Iraq now, because I think that comparison is a useful one. For a start, the foreign fighters in Afghanistan had no strategic impact on the war. One thing Afghans don't need a lot of help with is fighting other people. The word in Pashtun for enemy and cousin is the same word, so low-level endemic warfare is just part of the scene. At any given moment, there are something like 175 to 225,000 Afghans on the battlefield fighting the Russians. The foreign fighters who came, the rich guys like bin Laden and a few of his cronies, we're talking about, dozens of people in the mid-'80s, rising to perhaps several hundred by the end of the war. These guys had no, despite the hyperventilating rhetoric of bin Laden, they had no strategic impact on the war. They were also fighting one of the world's worst armies. They were fighting the all-conscript army of the Soviets. They were also fighting a classic guerrilla war. sort of hit-and-run kind of attacks. And there was no blowback during the war. I mean, there were no attacks around the world against the Soviet Union or its allies inspired by the Afghan conflict. There were no terrorist attacks generated by the Afghans even after the war against the Soviet Union. There were no Afghan members of al-Qaeda, strangely. So there are differences with Iraq are really quite striking because the foreign fighters have had a major strategic impact in Iraq. The foreign fighters, there's a book coming out shortly by Mohammed Hafez, which I really warmly recommend, called Suicide. It has the rather straightforward title, Suicide Bombers in Iraq. Now, he found that an overwhelming majority of the suicide bombers in Iraq were foreign. They tended to be Saudi. Now they're more North Africans. They're relatively few Iraqis. These suicide bombers got the United Nations to pull out. These suicide bombers sparked the civil war and continue to spark the civil war. The suicide bombers got Middle Eastern governments to pull out their representatives after the attack on the Jordanian embassy. And they've had, despite their very small numbers, perhaps 1,300 at any given moment, they've had a major strategic impact on the war. They've also inspired attacks from London to Madrid to Kabul as the war was actually going on. They've also been able to mount operations outside Iraq, for instance, the attack on the three American-owned hotels in Jordan in 2005. And they are indulging in a kind of warfare which will be very applicable to future acts of urban terrorism. It's IEDs, it's suicide attacks, it's urban warfare, as opposed to the kind of more conventional guerrilla warfare of the Afghan war. So, I mean, if you look at these differences, I think that the potential blowback from the Iraq war could look a lot nastier. Don't forget that the foreign fighters and their Iraqi allies are fighting the best army in history. And they're doing a pretty reasonable job, and they've had some successes. Not all the foreign fighters or their Iraqi allies will obviously survive the war, but you don't need a large number to survive for it to be a problem. The other sort of striking difference with the Afghan case is that al-Qaeda in Iraq, or as it's now called the Islamic State of Iraq, is a much more Iraqified organization than al-Qaeda was at the end of the Afghan war. I mentioned there were no Afghan members of al-Qaeda at its inception, or even for many years later. The al-Qaeda in Iraq, according to the agency's kind of estimation, is now a 90% Iraqi organization. And there should be a fairly obvious reason why that's the case. The Afghans and the Arabs were religiously, ideologically, culturally very, very different, whereas the kinds of foreign fighters who are being attracted to Iraq, the Saudis, the North Africans, are much more closer culturally to the Iraqis. And so these Sunni militant ideas have proven to be taken fruit in Iraq in a way that was not the case in Afghanistan. So I think these differences portend quite a lot of damage for the future. The only good news here is, of course, that al-Qaeda in Iraq today, or the Islamic State of Iraq, seems to be really on the back foot, both between the tribal leaders in Anbar province and also other insurgents groups who've now turned against the Islamic State of Iraq. A really striking sign of weakness to me was the Islamic State of Iraq recently released a videotape showing that they were about to do an IED operation and they halted it because there was a woman and some children who would have been killed. And that was really a response to the criticism that they've begun to generate within the insurgents themselves. Because of their indiscriminate use of violence, a number of the insurgent organizations have turned against them. And of course, that is, I think, and of course, we're helping the leaders in Anbar provinces and other parts of Iraq to fight al-Qaeda. So, there is some positive news here. I think that, if those two things proceed and al-Qaeda in Iraq is sort of decimated in Iraq, much of the sort of blowback effect might be tamped down. One final point is I disagree slightly with Stephanie on the question of sort of old school al-Qaeda and their abilities here. There's a very strong relationship between what bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri say and actually what al-Qaeda does. And so when bin Laden offers a truce to European countries willing to pull out of Iraq and the truce expires and then there's an attack in London by an al-Qaeda trained cell, to me there's a direct relationship there. when bin Laden mentions Madrid for the first time in September 2003, and there's an attack 6 months later in Madrid, killing 191 people, I feel that there is a direct relationship there. When Ayman al-Zawahiri calls for attacks on President Musharraf, and he survives 2 very serious assassination attempts within 3 months of those calls, there was a relationship there. The planes plot, the planes plot of 2006 demonstrates that al-Qaeda, classic as it were, retains a desire to do spectacular attacks. They're not interested in blowing up malls in Iowa or places they don't really know about. They selected the hardest target imaginable, which is commercial aviation. Luckily it didn't work, but it shows that they're interested in maintaining these spectacular plots. And I think that both bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri continue to influence the global jihad by their statements. In U.S. military doctrine, there's something called commander's intent. You don't really need to be told too often what the plan is: attack Westerners, Jews, Crusaders, etc. And I think they continue to influence things with those kinds of calls.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we have... this is not on, is it? Okay, we have about 45 minutes for questions. And I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to ask the first one, which is... As someone who's concerned about U.S. policy, I mean, I wonder what the answer or what the implications of what both of you have said are for the end state in Iraq. I mean, if we pull out, then does that reduce the problem, or does it have zero effect? I mean, does it matter if we stay? I mean, if you're going to give the president a 30-second description of the implication of his options in Iraq for global terrorist movements, what is that?
Well, first I just want to say that one of the people most responsible for writing the 9/11 Commission report is actually in the audience and not me. That's Dan Marcus, who is our general counsel, so I want to accept your gracious comment on his behalf. Your question is a good one, and I think there might be a slight difference in emphasis on the advice that Peter and I might give the president if we were so fortunate to be in that position. My emphasis and my work leads me to look at the process and the experience of warfighting as being highly detrimental to the movement. And so I am not as concerned with the end state as much as I am concerned in the process that we get to that end state. I can't predict what's going to happen, and anyone who can tell me whether there will or won't be a al-Qaeda base in Iraq has a crystal ball that I don't know of. But what I do know is that the process of getting to that point gives them a chance to fight, to train, to bring more people in, to raise more money, to inspire. And that process is not being incorporated into our policy-making process. And so that wasn't in 30 seconds, but what it is just encouraging people to shift an emphasis on the process versus the outcome.
My view about this is a complete withdrawal from Iraq would be to snatch a total catastrophe from the jaws of an enormous blunder for 2 reasons. One is the jihadists have a narrative about the United States. They also have a strategy. The narrative is familiar. It's Vietnam, it's Mogadishu, it's that we're a paper tiger, but it's much more deeper than simply confirming their narrative. It's what is their strategy, and their strategy has been laid out by Ayman al-Zawahiri, which is basically get a state or part of a state somewhere in the Middle East, regroup, and basically have Afghanistan Part 2. How do we, and that on the other hand, of course, Iraq is radicalizing people. It's a cause célèbre, as the NIE pointed out, etc. So these 2 points are sort of in tension because, in a sense, we're sort of damned if we do and damned if we don't. But it seems to me a force of something like 30,000 U.S. military soldiers in Iraq for the foreseeable future would be the amount of that would be the amount of soldiers you would need to secure what is after all the largest embassy in the world, the bases we have there, maintain enough special forces so you can go after al-Qaeda in Iraq and its affiliates, and also train the local groups that you're hoping to do this. We're not necessarily arming these groups. We're trying. The most effective thing we can do is train them. It's not like there isn't a lot of. They already have plenty of AK-47s. What they need is training, and so that would be my advice, for what it's worth.
Great. So we're going to open up the questions to the floor. If anyone would like to ask a question. Here on the left.
My name's Adam Carrasso. I also work at the New America Foundation. I'm just curious if you could say a little more about the finance. How critical finance has been to these groups' formation and their continued evolution and going on beyond the war. And does the financing role change? I mean, does it become less crucial? Are there different actors? And also, you know, this whole talk so far has been about the Sunni side. What's the possible Shia response, and why wouldn't us withdrawing from Iraq and then let's say they try to set up some sort of the Sunnis, Al-Qaeda tries to set up some sort of half state in Iraq? Why doesn't that become a bigger thorn in Iran's side than it becomes a worry for us?
Well, of course, information about financing is few and far between for people perched up at MIT, but there was a really interesting report in the LA Times recently about how they're commenting on a government report that said that the Iraq War had become the main fundraising opportunity for jihadists, and that they had evidence of little side payments from the war being sent over to the borderland for what someone called overhead and bin Laden overhead. And this is one of the things that actually makes me think that they don't have as much control, because at the beginning of Al-Qaeda, the financial flows were in the other direction. Bin Laden was pushing out the money. People were coming to him and asking him for things. And so now I think you see, from what I've read, and I could be wrong, a little bit more of a reverse trend in the financial flows. And so, you know, he's no longer the fundraiser, and that must mean that he doesn't have as much control as he would like. That doesn't mean he doesn't try, and that doesn't mean that we don't see evidence of some attacks that are according to his modus operandi. But I don't think that they're all going exactly the way he would like.
Where's he getting the money from?
Well, I mean, look, terrorism is a cheap form of warfare. The first Trade Center attack cost like $10,000. The Madrid attacks cost $40,000. The 9/11 attacks cost $500,000, which, as bin Laden pointed out, was every dollar they put in, it cost $1 million to the United States, since it cost $500 billion to our economy. So, as a general proposition, terrorism just doesn't need a lot of money. What you need is people willing to kind of commit suicide. I mean, none of the 9/11 hijackers were sending money back. Clearly, they were motivated by very strong religious sentiments. So it's sort of a problem of mirror imaging, basically thinking that everything must work exactly the same way it works in the West, that money is very important. Of course, that's not the case. Now, right at the beginning of the founding of Al-Qaeda, money was quite important to the founding of Al-Qaeda, because Osama had some pretty deep pockets, and people like Ayman al-Zawahiri basically saw him as sort of an ATM that would help them out with basically creating this organization. But again, the amounts of money were not necessarily large. Several $100,000 was more than enough for bin Laden to fund some of the fighters coming to the Soviet Union. But the question, I think, about Iraq is a very interesting one, because by kidnapping somebody in Iraq now, you can make $20 million. That's the kind of money we're talking about when Italians or French get kidnapped and their governments pay a ransom. And so, given the fact that terrorism is a cheap form of warfare, and there's quite a lot of money floating around between the kidnappings and the oil smugglings, it's not surprising that Ayman al-Zawahiri wrote Zarqawi a letter basically saying, do you have 100,000 handy that you can send to us? I think one of the critical differences with the Iraq War is there's going to be more financing coming out of Iraq for the foreseeable future as a way of financing other terrorist attacks than there was in the case of the Afghan War.
I would direct people's attention to a report published by the United Nations that actually has cost estimates for a number of significant al-Qaeda attacks, which I, sort of moment of self-promotion, will share, that I used as the basis for an article that I had in Foreign Policy magazine. And many of the attacks are in the sort of $40,000 to $50,000 range, which, if you think about it, is a very modest foundation grant to a research project. Stephanie, did you want to say something more about financing?
No, I think.
Okay. Here.
I'd like to just turn the perspective from what the jihadists are saying among themselves. As we're debating this today, there are lots of places around with guys drinking cups of tea that are debating this same subject today. And one of the initial starting points that would hope you would, is that the initial attack on 9/11, a number of people have proposed, was really a key part of the al-Qaeda strategy to engage the United States in a land warfare in Afghanistan, which they felt they would win. So we are playing against a very intelligent, thoughtful enemy, which has now a number of divisions inside of a number of debates. Could you discuss those from the start?
That's a great question, and it gives me an opportunity to revisit a couple of things that Peter said earlier. What the jihadists are saying among themselves, I think one of the best people to read on this topic is a gentleman by the name of Will McCants, who's up at the West Point Counterterrorism Center. He is translating and interpreting just an incredible amount of documentation from the field, from jihadist strategists, and not only looking at the statements of bin Laden and Zawahiri, but looking at a second class of kind of jihadist strategists who are doling out advice to people in the field, and they've even done some network analysis and linkage analysis, and I'm sorry if I'm mischaracterizing it, that looks at who these jihadists are listening to, who are the most important people that are driving their ideology and their beliefs, and what their conclusion was is that it's not actually bin Laden and Zawahiri anymore. They're reading a lot of these other low-level strategists, one of whom I quoted, Abu Bakr al-Naji, and they talk about exactly precisely the thing the scenario that you described, pulling the United States into a war and having that war be one of those really productive experiences that I described. I mean, in a way, there's a tension. Yes, they want a state, but at the same time, they want the United States there. And so you have to wonder which one to listen to. And that's why getting involved in a defensive jihad is really a no-win situation for us, because when we're there, they win, and then when we lose, and then when we leave, they win.
You know, on the defensive jihad point, very interesting. You know, one of the kind of classic, kind of conventional pieces of wisdom is that Muslim clerics won't condemn terrorism. And in fact, there's Al-Azhar University, which is the Vatican of Sunni thought, condemned 9/11. Fadallah, the sort of spiritual leader of Hezbollah, condemned 9/11. But both of them said Iraq was a defensive jihad. So I couldn't agree more with Stephanie that, you know, that if we getting ourselves into a defensive jihad is going to have very long-term problems. Hopefully we won't be getting into any new ones anytime soon. An attack on Iran, for instance, might have some unintended consequences. About the question of debates, you know, Freud has a wonderful term, the narcissism of minor differences, which is a very good way of looking at a lot of civil wars. But and of course the jihadists often hate each other as much as they hate more than they hate the Bush administration, and they're furious debates. And one of the most interesting debates is what happened after 9/11. Because of the Harmony documents we picked up in Afghanistan, we actually know what people were saying internally about the 9/11 attacks. And you know, Bin Laden was the subject of a lot of internal criticism. Basically, he overreached. We've got this 800-pound gorilla after us. It didn't turn out to be a Soviet-style invasion. It turned out to be 300 U.S. special forces and a lot of Afghans. We had this great thing going with the Taliban. Now they're gone. We're dispersed. So there was a lot of criticism of Bin Laden internally, and also, by the way, this debate, a lot of it took place publicly in Arab language newspapers, like Al-Shawq al-Awsat, people within Al-Qaeda publishing their memoirs criticizing the 9/11 attacks. But then, of course, the Iraq War came along, and that was something that they could all get around. So there are always these debates. Even Zawahiri told Zarqawi, enough with the beheadings, you're turning people off. And that's just part of it. Can we manipulate these things? And returning to your sheer question, I think that our ability to manipulate these sort of things is essentially zero. One of the most astonishing kind of headlines was the piece in the Post that we're arming Fatah, about 2 months ago, and I was like, wow, this is like the Bay of Goats. It's like, there's no historical memory here. We tried to help out, we're helping out Hamas initially because we thought of them as a counter to Fatah. So I think we can acknowledge that these things are happening. Our ability to kind of manipulate them, I think, is pretty low.
On the left.
You talked a lot about terrorist resource management in Iraq. Can you talk about resource management in Afghanistan now with regard specifically briefly to the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So we're seeing a feeding effect. You've got Iraq-trained militants causing an uptick in suicide bombings, which is not something you saw mainly under the Taliban resistance. So who's controlling the terrorist resources, and what is their goal?
That's a great question as well, and that's not something that I've studied completely in detail as much as I would like. But I will say that, I mean, one of the key flows of resources that is most important to understand about the Afghanistan war currently is the flow of skills and people from Iraq to Afghanistan. And so I think one of the most important things that you found in your study is how much the in-theater attacks in Afghanistan has spiked as a result of the Iraq War. They're learning a lot from the theater across the way. And so it's not the story in Afghanistan, I'm not sure, is so much about who's managing the resources there, so much as what its relationship is to the broader, the big game that's going on across the pond.
Yeah, in our study we found that, if Robert Pape is correct, that suicide bombing is always a response to the presence of foreign troops, then it's very puzzling why there were no suicide attacks in Afghanistan in 2001 and 2002. So they really start, and even in 2003, they really start spiking in 2004. Suicide attacks in 2005 were 27, there were 139 last year. So there's something else going on here. It was copycatting from Iraq, some evidence of people traveling to Iraq. You may remember there was an al-Qaeda leader who escaped from Bagram Air Force Base. He ended up being killed in Basra as one of the evidence for people for this kind of movement from Afghanistan to Iraq. But what the Taliban, in my view, have morphed together ideologically and tactically with al-Qaeda. After all, the Taliban now has a sort of production video arm, ironically, for a group that had actually banned television when it was in power. Very similar to Al-Qaeda's, it's called Umat video. It's very similar to As-Sahab video, which is the Al-Qaeda. Suicide attacks have quintupled last year. IED attacks have doubled. They promised a spring offensive. It didn't happen. The reason it didn't happen is conventional military offensives by the Taliban against the U.S. military get a sort of 30 to 40% casualty rate. So they're completely moving to the Iraqi-style insurgency. It's effective. It's been effective in Iraq. It's quite effective in Afghanistan now. Half the country is basically a no-go area for foreigners. And so that is, I think the Taliban's most important thing is this morphing together with Al-Qaeda. Where they're deriving their money from is, they're deriving their money partly from the drug trade, partly from kidnapping. They kidnapped an Italian photojournalist. The Italian government gave $2 million as a ransom. That money goes a long way. And so between the ransoms and the drug money, the Taliban are doing fine. And they are paying people. They're paying people about $100 a month, up to $300 a month, which compares pretty favorably to the $70 a month you get as an Afghan policeman.
Sadly, I think that's better than we pay our interns.
Al-Qaeda had a much, one of the interesting things after 9/11, we picked up the employment forms for Al-Qaeda, and it turns out that Al-Qaeda had a more generous vacation policy than my employer, CNN. It was like 2 months vacation a year.
Before I take another question, I want to follow up on that, because if I heard you both correctly, I think there's an important point there, which is we often talk about the effect of Iraq on Afghanistan as in terms of detracting and removing resources that would be necessary to win. But you both seem to be saying that the effect of Iraq is to export talent, techniques, and potentially people that could actually cause us to lose Afghanistan, so that the effect of the invasion of Iraq may be that we lose Afghanistan because of what gets exported out of Iraq. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, I don't think we're going to lose in Afghanistan, because the Taliban they used to be a nuisance in 2002, 2003. Now they're a major tactical problem, but they're not a strategic problem. I mean, we're looking at about 12,000 people. You've got 27,000 American troops. You've got 70,000 guys in the Afghan army. You've got roughly 30,000 people in NATO. The Taliban just don't have the numbers. Unfortunately, they do have we use this word safe haven. They've got a safe haven. This is really the critical thing. If you don't have a safe haven, it's quite difficult to kind of continue an insurgency. And they have the one there on the tribal areas in Pakistan is working pretty well for them. So the Iraq War has made Afghanistan, which is a kind of classic case of a glass half empty, glass half full. There's very clearly a downward trend, and it's related to what's happening in Iraq. But I don't think we're going to lose Afghanistan as a result of the Iraq War. Certainly, the Bush administration, to its credit, not a combination of words you often use in one sentence, finally realized they can't lose two wars at once. And so I actually asked for $11 billion in aid. There's a bill in the House for $2 billion in additional money. And these are the right things to do. And 3,500 more American troops have gone in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, Iraq has sort of made Afghanistan worse, I think, but it's not. We're not going to lose the war in Afghanistan.
Stephanie, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
I think you covered all the points.
Right here on the right.
Yeah, Stephanie and Peter, you've both made very persuasive arguments for how to think about terrorism that have been incredibly helpful. You also both mentioned Rumsfeld's now famous 2003 memorandum about whether we're creating more terrorists that we can kill. Who do you see now in the U.S. government thinking in these very brute terms, or is this kind of thinking gone out the door?
Do you mean who is thinking creatively like Rumsfeld did in that particular memo?
I mean, have we gone anywhere in 4 years in official thinking about how to imagine this kind of policy problem?
Well, I can't speak to, I don't have a comprehensive assessment of every counterterrorist specialist in the government, and certainly some of them are my former colleagues, and I respect them very much. What I can say is that I read the most recent counterterrorism annual report from the State Department, and there were some very pleasant movements forward, thinking in the direction that I tend to think, and there was also some major sticking points. Like, for example, it won't say that Iraq is a failed state. And that's a big deal. If you can't admit that Iraq is a failed state, then you either have to redefine what a definition of a failed state is, or come up with a new definite category for explaining this important relationship between, war and terrorism that I've discussed ad nauseum for you this afternoon. So that's just one of the first points. And so I can only look at the documents that the administration produces, and that was something that was a major, major sticking point for me.
I mean, if you were to take one group of people who kind of get this better than anybody else, it's the U.S. military. They're the people who've been killed, and they're the people, the people who run the U.S. military are a very intelligent group of people. And take General Eikenberry in Afghanistan, who was until recently the commander there. The mantra of this is a political problem, not a military problem, is one that had gone down to the lowest levels of the army as a result of his. And of course, Petraeus, rewrote the counterinsurgency doctrine for the army. Except that there is no doctrine for how we intervene in a civil war and get it to stop. But at least there's been progress. And I think if you were another example I would give is David Cullen in the State Department, who basically he's now working for Petraeus, but who I think he gave the best kind of. I hate to use the word disaggregation, but that's the word that he uses, which is basically that we can't basically make the mistake of falling into bin Laden's rhetorical trap that there is this global jihad against us, so all these different groups are united. Of course, they're not. They're actually quite diffuse and disparate, and as you pointed out in your question, they often argue amongst each other. So, I mean, I think there has been substantial progress in the last several years. The question is, it doesn't really matter if the politics is not aligned with either the military or the State Department.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, and then
one of the problems that I share is there's an enormous disconnect. This is interesting and important and critical, but irrelevant, because it does not at this stage meet the major demands of the political forces of the country, which is to get reelected in the next general election, in which the Iraq issue is going to be formulated and characterized by the opinion leaders. The right has been quite correct that Bush has done an absolutely failure of a job in terms of gearing up the American people to understand and to support what are important national security goals and objectives in Iraq. As Larry Eagleburger, one of your commissioners, once noted to his regret, that all great powers have got to be able to defend their national interests with their blood. We are not prepared to do that in the present political circumstances because the case has not been sold. So my question to you is, how do we politically take the information, the ideas, the perceptions that you have, package them in a way that you motivate Americans at a political level to engage in? Forget the policy. How do you do this at a political level?
I have no idea. I mean, that's not my job description. But I mean, let me just give you just a sort of tactical answer to this question. I mean, if indeed Stephanie is correct and I'm correct, and there is going to be this problem, the Iraq War, and its sort of blowback and consequences, what do we do about it? And I think from a tactical point of view, there's quite a simple thing we should do. First of all, we need to sort of map out who these jihadists are, and we also need to map out who their clerical benefactors are. And this is not that difficult because I mentioned earlier the Mohammed Hafez book that will be coming out. I mean, the reason that he can tell you a lot about the suicide bombers is the suicide bombers get on the jihadi websites, they explain who they are and where they're from. And both in the case of the Afghan War and the Iraq War, we should try and work out exactly who these people are, who are the clerics who are encouraging this, because I think we'll find that the number of clerics involved is actually pretty small. This would be, A, be good, useful intelligence, but B, would be kind of useful for policymakers because we could go to our Saudi colleagues and say, we've identified these 6 clerics as really the big problem. And of course, we're not just saying this to be nice, it's going to be, it's in our interest, but also your interest because it's going to blow back hardest on you when the conflict's over. And we can do the same thing with the Pakistanis. So that's just a really simple tactical idea about how to, rein this thing in. But imagine if we'd had a database of all the people who'd gone to fight in Afghanistan during the 80s. I mean, imagine if we'd had that, we wouldn't. And the whole Al-Qaeda problem would be much different. And I think in the Iraq case, we could actually create something. Obviously, some people were never going to know their identities, but there's enough public information out there now in the media, on jihadi websites to do this.
Stephanie, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah.
Please.
Well, I think the first thing you need to do is have the discussion. You need to have the debate. You need to just force people to the edge of and to think creatively about this problem. And what really motivated me to start thinking about this problem was this constant reference to the Afghanistan analogy. People whom I respect, people whom the work of whom I admire, are still making these facile references to the Soviet-Afghan War to explain the terrorism problem that Iraq is going to bring. They don't separate and compare the two cases the way that Peter has done, the way that I have done. And so in order to have, to start persuading people that it's a problem, you have to identify the problem and make a strong case for what it is. So I think I'm really grateful to the New America Foundation for giving me a chance to communicate those ideas.
I want to pick up on that. One of the biggest differences between the Afghan situation and the Iraq situation, we now have the founding minutes of Al-Qaeda's first meetings. And in fact, I use them in a recent book. And there's a very striking thing that isn't in there. There's no reference to a desire to attack the West, the United States. When Al-Qaeda, these were anti-American guys, but they hadn't decided on their anti-American project until at least 2 years after the group was founded. In Iraq, of course, I mean, everybody involved is a pathologically anti-American, even if they're not Islamists. So that again, I think underlines the fact that this could be worse. You also out there have Nir Rosen's piece. 2 million refugees outside the country, 2 million displaced internally. Those numbers could go up to 4 million outside, 4 million internally. We pissed off a lot of Iraqis. They're going to be people who want to take a revenge. And as I've indicated, I think that the Afghans did not buy into this militant Sunni Islam idea. A fair number of Iraqis have. That's of course going to be the big problem coming down the pike.
This person who's been rather patient on the left.
I'm Ibrahim Nasser from Voice of America, Afghan Service. I've got 2 questions. The first question is with, when we are talking about the flow of resources, I think we missed 2 things. One is drugs. We didn't even talk about that. The second thing is the links of Taliban with the Pakistani intelligence agencies and the army. Some people indicated that too. So I would leave drugs to one side, just focus on the Pakistani military and intelligence agencies links with to Taliban. If in the coming election, political parties, rather than the military, wins election, what difference will they make to the situation in Afghanistan? Or how will they change their policies? And my second question is going to Iraq. Given that Iraq has a long history of living under a secular government, so what are the chances for Al-Qaeda if Americans are not in Iraq today? So do you think they will be successful in making Islamic State based on Sharia?
Sorry, I couldn't hear all of your question that well, but I will try to answer it in full. So you had two parts. One is about Pakistan, and the second is about the chances of Al-Qaeda taking over Iraq. The first part, I'll just say that from my perspective and the research I've done, the most important part about Pakistan policy is how it influences and shapes the ability of Al-Qaeda's high commanders to have a safe haven and mobilize and consolidate resources. So in my framework, the way I look at the world, there are resources flowing around and different actors competing for them, and the actors that are sitting up in the hills, and we want to care how much we want to know what their ability is to influence the control of those resources. And to the extent that Pakistan policy influences that, then we should care about that. That's how I think about that problem. The second one is that I don't think it's that likely that Al-Qaeda can take over Iraq. It is such a complex mapping and mosaic of conflicts that it would never work out. But most importantly, because it's a movement, it kind of relates to my research in the sense that it's not designed to, it's not a good state, it can't run a state the way that we think about running states. It talks about doing it, but I think it entails a variety of other mechanisms and operations that Al-Qaeda is just not good at and wouldn't be good at. And so I don't think we're going to see that happen anytime soon.
Yeah, Al-Qaeda or groups like Al-Qaeda can't take over Iraq or any Muslim country because they have 4 strategic weaknesses that basically ensure they can't turn themselves into Hezbollah. They kill too many Muslim civilians. Anybody who disagrees with them is an enemy. It's never a winning strategy to constantly increase the pool of enemies you have. They have no positive vision of the future. We know what they're against, but what are they really for? Other than sort of vague references to restoration of the caliphate, which, when it existed, was the Ottoman Empire, a relatively rational group of people. But what they mean is Taliban-style theocracies from Indonesia to Morocco, and most Muslims don't want that. And they don't really have mass support. I mean, Al-Qaeda in Iraq is a relatively small group of people with a lot of enemies in Iraq right now. The most important election outside our own election is the election in Pakistan. In my view, the war on terrorism is the election of the fall of 2007 in Pakistan. And to your question, if the secular political parties win, which of course in a free and fair election they would there be a different policy in Pakistan on the Taliban or even Al-Qaeda? Benazir Bhutto has got a little bit of amnesia about the fact that the Taliban were actually sort of came up under her watch. She said a lot of good things about, her interior minister in 1994 was basically fairly instrumental in helping the Taliban along. There are a lot of people who gave them a pass initially. So I'm not sure. I think in terms of a slightly different question, what is the best thing that could happen for Pakistan? The best thing that could happen to Pakistan is a return to genuine civilian rule. It's not an accident that when the British in '48 created India and Pakistan, India has been much more successful because it hasn't reverted to military rule 4 times in the last 50+ years. And so I think that in that election, the best outcome, even if we're not completely pleased about who is actually in charge, but in the long-term interest of Pakistan and in our own, a genuine civilian rule is I think, the best outcome.
In the back.
Yes. I'm interested to ask the panel if I can shift this a little bit about the blowback and about resources generated, and ask you what would have happened if the enablers of the war had, in their ignorance and incompetence of their assessment of what would happen, what would have happened if they had secured the thousands and thousands of unsecured ammunition dumps that for all over the country, that even as of a month or 6 months ago, the government general office said that there's still some ammunition dumps that are unsecured because we don't have the resources to secure them.
Could you both hear that?
Yeah.
No. Okay.
I think you answered your own question.
I'll just add to that. There's a very interesting report out of NDU a couple years ago that I think Jeffrey pointed me to, that studied went back and took a look at our pre-war planning for actually going and finding weapons of mass destruction. And what's interesting about that is, despite the fact that weapons of mass destruction was one of the touted reasons for going into the war, you don't see much evidence in pre-war planning of planning to actually deal with the after effects of that. So that's setting that aside, though. Of course, the weapons that we really needed to be worried about are the ones that you described, and so that's feeding into the process that I described today.
Diane Perlman, I'm a social scientist. In terms of trying to be creative, I'd like to maybe refer to bodies of knowledge in the field of conflict studies and also cycles of violence and how terrorism ends. And also, Peter, you mentioned Pape's work, but why it didn't happen there, but also I think there are correlations between when there is suicide terrorism, that when it ends, and that a lot of it is a function of occupation, and that under occupation, every group in society sort of split into two. So it creates a field that drives a lot of violence. Also, Martha Crenshaw has a body of knowledge on how terrorism ends, and when there are certain needs, if it's instrumental, when there are needs that are met. And also, I think, a lot of things focus on the symptom rather than the cause. And, I call the difference between counterterrorism and terror reduction, which is reducing desire of parties to take revenge and differentiating just grievances from unjust grievances and legitimate goals and basic human needs from illegitimate. And I think we can find more creative, tension-reducing answers.
Okay, so how terrorism ends.
There's a lot in there. I'll answer that in a couple of ways. First of all, I just came from the annual conference of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. Martha Crenshaw is my mentor there. And we spent a lot of time talking about the various ways in which terrorist groups desist. And it's a very complex issue. There are a lot of different ways and mechanisms that we have hypothesized about why terrorist groups desist, but there's certainly not a definitive answer out there, and there's a lot more work to be done, and we were figuring out ways to do that this weekend. But your point that you made about causes versus symptoms, my work is actually directed explicitly at this point, but I don't think you can also look at the terrorism problem as causes. This idea that there's root causes of terrorism is really, I think, a misguided belief, because if you believe the root cause of terrorism is humiliation, then there are a lot of people humiliated and we should see more terrorism. If you believe a root cause of terrorism is socioeconomic factors, which has been disproven in some of the literature, then there should be more terrorism than we see because there are a lot of poor people. So my work is trying to look not at kind of these structural factors in society, but the processes through which people become radicalized. And one of those processes is that they fight in wars. And so that's why I'm trying to limit the scope of the inquiry in this way. And I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm certainly sympathetic to your point.
I don't see this ending with the Al-Qaeda and its affiliates anytime soon. If it was about simply occupation of the foreign occupation, as Pape has sort of suggested, then it's quite striking that the U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia, which was the beginning of Al-Qaeda's, basically jihad against the United States, doesn't exist anymore. Bin Laden has never acknowledged this was his central political demand. And the problem is he's got too many political demands. Most terrorist organizations want one thing. They want the British out of Northern Ireland, or they want a Basque state, or whatever it is. And those sorts of demands can be satisfied. But bin Laden wants to roll back all aspects of American policy in the Middle East. He wants to destroy Israel. He wants to get the Russians out of Chechnya. He wants, the laundry list goes on and on and on. And so you can't, in that sort of case, there's no way to really negotiate with such groups. And they haven't really changed. They haven't, as a result of our pull-out of Saudi, they changed their desire to attack the United States. And also they conceive of it in a very long-term manner. Ayman al-Zawahiri in his autobiography pointed out it took 200 years to get the Crusaders out of the Middle East. It took 100+ years to get the French out of Algeria. It took 70 years to get the British out of Egypt. So the way they conceive of it is very similar to the way the Pentagon conceives of it. They both think of it as a long war, and unfortunately that's a pretty accurate description of how it's likely to be.
I just want to piggyback and go back because you mentioned Bob Pape, and I never addressed it in my paper, and since it's a very popular book in Washington, I think in your article on Iraq Effect, you came to the conclusion that I did, that there are many points in his book that are interesting, but this problem is not a nationalism problem. It's a transnational Islamic identity problem, and so I think there are lots of us in the community who are grateful for his focus on the work in this area, but But nationalism is not what is driving this problem. It's decidedly non-nationalist. And I just want to...
I really want to agree with Stephanie completely. I mean, look, the largest suicide campaign in history is being conducted largely by foreigners in Iraq. They're not motivated by Iraqi nationalism. They are, by their own account, motivated by feelings, very strong feelings that Islam is under attack. Look at the 9/11 hijackings. It's very hard to explain why Ziad Jarrah, who's a Lebanese, I don't think we're going to occupy Lebanon anytime in the near future, or Mohammed Atta, last time I checked, we're not occupying Egypt, or the guy from the United Arab Emirates. I mean, there's just, I think he did good work to say this is not always a religious problem. That is, and I agree with that. But unfortunately, as soon as the book came out of the bookstore, it basically was DOA, and unfortunately, he hasn't really tried to deal with the Iraq problem, because what is going on in Iraq. How do you explain, Muriel de Gouk, the Belgian female baker's assistant who conducted a suicide attack with her Tunisian husband in Iraq in November of 2005? This is clearly not a nationalist thing. This is something else, and it's religion. And by the way, we should just listen to what people are saying about their own motivations. When they talk about religion all the time, it may just have something to do with religion.
I realize I quite literally have a blind spot with this, so are there any questions here where I can't see people? No? Okay, excellent. So, in the back.
One quick question. How can you tell that Islam is not under attack without using violence?
I'm sorry, could you speak up, because we just can't hear you?
Would there be any way to tell those people that Islam is not under attack by the West?
I see.
Without having to use violence.
Right. So, how do you communicate that this is not an attack on Islam? Without. Yeah.
I don't think there's a way to communicate that the Iraq War was not an attack on Islam. We invaded the second holiest land in Sunni territory, and what's done is done. So you communicate these ideas through your actions. This is why I think action versus public diplomacy and our foreign policy is much more important in affecting our counterterrorism policy than public diplomacy, because we can talk and we can talk and we can talk all we want, but it won't change what we do.
I agree completely. I mean, if you look at attitudes towards the United States after the relief efforts and after the tsunami in Indonesia, they basically had a sort of 180-degree turnaround. So, we know in our own lives it's not what people say, it's what they do to us. And our public diplomacy obviously is not great, but if the underlying facts are not sort of aligned in our favor, it doesn't matter what we say about them.
I actually think that's a nice place to leave it, unless either of you have something you wish to add.
Thank you.
Join me in thanking Stephanie.